The wind was a knife blade against her cheek, thin and sharp, carrying the scent of dry earth and the promise of unending winter. Eleanor pulled the rough shawl tighter around her shoulders, the threadbare wool offering little defense against the chill that seemed to leach from the very ground. It had been 3 days since they arrived, Thomas's cousins and his uncle Silas, their faces grim and set like the hard prairie stone. 3 days since they stood over his fresh grave, small and lonely on the hill, and spoke words that felt less like comfort and more like pronouncements. Now, they sat inside the small cabin, the fire crackling meagerly, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to mock the cold reality of their purpose. Her purpose, Thomas's purpose, had died with him. Now their purpose was her. It's unfortunate, Eleanor, Uncle Silas. Not the quiet farmer from next door, but Thomas's paternal uncle, a man whose eyes held the calculating glint of a merchant, said, his voice lacking any genuine sorrow, merely a performative gravitas. A woman alone. This land is no place for it. Thomas's cousins, Jedediah and Obadiah, nodded in silent agreement, their bulky forms filling the small space, making it feel suffocating. Their gazes swept over the cabin's contents, the worn furniture, the few simple possessions, the half-empty larder, as if assessing their worth, their rightful claim. Thomas, he wanted me to stay here, Eleanor managed, her voice thin, raspy from grief and fear. The cabin, their home for 2 short years, suddenly felt alien, temporary. Every plank, every nail, every carefully placed stone of the hearth spoke of Thomas's labor, their shared dream. Now it was just a shell, and she was an unwanted inhabitant. Jedediah scoffed, a harsh sound that grated on her raw nerves. What Thomas wanted matters little now. The land passes to the family. A woman has no claim. I am his wife, she stated, though the words felt hollow, powerless against the solid wall of their resolve. In this world, the law was often interpreted by those with the most muscle, the loudest voice, the deepest pockets. Thomas's family had all 3. Was his wife? Obadiah corrected, his tone deliberately cruel. You produced no heir. The line must continue. This farm, this cabin, they belonged to Thomas's blood. Not a woman with no son. The unspoken accusation hung heavy in the air. Her failure to conceive was not just a personal sorrow. It was, in their eyes, a betrayal, a forfeiture of any right she might have had. Tears pricked at her eyes, but she blinked them back fiercely. She would not cry in front of them. They wanted to see her break. We will give you until the end of the week, Uncle Silas declared, rising from his chair, a finality in his posture. Gather what is yours. Only personal effects. The livestock, the tools, the stores. They remain here. We will send for them. Personal effects. Her few dresses, a small box of sentimental items, Thomas's Bible. That was all they would allow her to take from the life they had built together. The life they had built on this harsh, unforgiving land that was now deemed too much for her. As they left, the wind howled around the cabin, rattling the window panes, a mournful, desolate sound that echoed the emptiness inside her. She was alone, utterly and completely alone, with nowhere to go and nothing but the clothes on her back and a few meager possessions to her name. The future stretched before her, a vast, terrifying emptiness, mirroring the desolate landscape outside. The cold seeped deeper into her bones, a chill that had nothing to do with the weather and everything to do with the icy grip of despair. She had buried her husband, and now his family was burying her, casting her off like ballast no longer needed on a sinking ship. Survival here demanded strength, resilience, a partnership with the land and with another soul. Thomas had been her partner. Now only the land remained, indifferent to her plight, and the people who saw her as nothing more than an obstacle to their inheritance. She sank onto the stool by the hearth, the meager warmth doing little to chase away the profound, bone-deep cold. What was she to do? Where could she go? The questions had no answers, only the howling wind and the encroaching darkness. The next few days were a blur of quiet, desperate activity. Eleanor moved through the cabin like a ghost, touching the things Thomas had touched, seeing his presence in every corner, every object. The rough-hewn table they had eaten at, the axe leaning by the door he had used to chop wood, the small, chipped mug he preferred for his coffee. Each item was a small, sharp pain. She folded the few pieces of clothing that were hers, placing them in a worn satchel. She gathered the letters Thomas had written her before they married, tied them with a ribbon, and placed them carefully inside. His Bible, its pages thumbed and marked, went in too. That was all she would take. The in-laws had left her a small sack of flour, some salt pork, and a handful of beans. Charity meant to underscore her dependence and their generosity in not leaving her entirely destitute on the spot. It felt like a final insult, a pittance offered to dismiss any lingering sense of obligation. She didn't light a fire often, conserving the precious wood. The cold was a constant companion, a dull ache in her hands and feet. Her thoughts were a frantic scramble, searching for solutions where none existed. Go back east? She had no family left there, no skills beyond keeping a home and working a small farm, skills useless without land or resources. Seek work in a town? The nearest was days away, and opportunities for a lone woman were scarce and often dangerous. The prairie, vast and indifferent, surrounded the small cabin, a constant reminder of her isolation. From the cabin window, she could see the neighboring homestead, smaller than theirs, set further back against a low rise. Silas Blackwood's place. He was a man of few words, known for his quiet competence with the land and his solitary nature. Thomas had traded with him occasionally small favors, a shared meal when riding by. Silas was a mystery to most, living alone, his past unspoken. She had barely exchanged a dozen sentences with him in 2 years. Now, she watched his silhouette against the setting sun, a lone figure moving with purpose, tending to his own small patch of earth. He seemed as much a part of the landscape as the rocks and the trees that dotted the horizon. One afternoon, as she sat on the porch, listlessly watching the road, she saw Uncle Silas's wagon approaching. The week was not yet out, but they were coming early. Dread coiled in her stomach, cold and heavy. She knew what this meant. They weren't just collecting items. They were coming to ensure she was gone, to perhaps speed her departure with threats or force. Her heart hammered against her ribs. There was no one to help her, no one within miles who would intervene, even if they knew. She was truly alone. She stood slowly, straightening her shoulders, trying to summon a dignity she didn't feel. She would face them standing, not cowering. The wagon pulled up, the horses snorting in the cold air. Jedediah and Obadiah dismounted first, their faces hard, their eyes scanning the cabin and the yard as if looking for signs of resistance. Uncle Silas remained seated in the wagon, his arms crossed, a look of impatient finality on his face. "Eleanor," Jedediah said, his voice rough, "packing done?" "I am finishing," she replied, her voice trembling slightly despite her efforts. "Finishing should have been done," Obadiah added, stepping towards the porch. "We have no time to waste. This is my home," she said, a desperate, futile assertion. Jedediah laughed, a short, unpleasant sound. "Not anymore, girl. Not for days now. You've overstayed your welcome." He took another step towards her, his hand reaching for her arm. Panic flared, sharp and hot. Just then, a voice cut through the tension, quiet but firm. "Gentlemen." They all turned. Silas Blackwood stood perhaps 50 yards away, by the edge of his property line that bordered Thomas's land. He wasn't holding a weapon, but his presence was commanding, unexpected. He wasn't a large man, but there was a stillness about him, a quiet strength that gave pause. He wasn't looking directly at any of them. His gaze seemed fixed on a point somewhere between the two homesteads. Uncle Silas narrowed his eyes. "This doesn't concern you, Blackwood. This is family business." Silas Blackwood finally looked towards them, his eyes calm, steady. "Perhaps it does. I came to offer Mrs. Eleanor a proposition." Jedediah snorted again. "Proposition? What proposition could you offer a woman who's about to be on the road with nothing?" Silas Blackwood didn't react to the cruelty. He simply stated, his voice level, "I am in need of a wife." The air went utterly still. Eleanor stared at him, stunned. A wife? Him? The solitary, silent man? Uncle Silas's face contorted in disbelief, then sputtered into outraged laughter. A wife? You? Blackwood, you're mad. And she wouldn't take kindly to charity marriage. Not from a man like you. Silas Blackwood's gaze shifted to Eleanor then, meeting her eyes for the first time. There was no pity there, no expectation, just a simple, unreadable question. It would be a practical arrangement. Shelter and safety in exchange for help with the farm, with the house. Legal protection. They would have no claim if you were married. His eyes flickered towards the in-laws. It would be a recognized union. Eleanor's mind reeled. Practical arrangement. A marriage of necessity. Not love, not companionship, but a roof over her head, protection from these vultures, a chance to survive. The humiliation of her situation, the public nature of this offer, burned in her cheeks. But the alternative, destitution, starvation, something worse. Uncle Silas recovered his voice, his face red with fury. This changes nothing. She cannot just marry off Thomas's property. Silas Blackwood's voice was low, almost a murmur, but it carried authority. She would be my wife, my property if you see it that way, and I would protect my own. The law recognizes a husband's right to his wife and his obligation to provide for her. You would have no claim on her, and no claim on what is mine. His gaze was steady, unwavering. He wasn't threatening, merely stating a fact, a legal loophole, a potential barrier to their greed. The in-laws exchanged looks. The offer, however unconventional, was legally significant. A married woman, particularly married to a landholder, was not the easy target they had envisioned. Their plan relied on her utter helplessness and lack of connections. Silas Blackwood looked back at Eleanor, his expression still unreadable, waiting. The wind whipped her hair around her face. The cold felt less significant now than the turmoil inside her. Marry a stranger? A quiet, perhaps lonely man with an unknown past? Or face the absolute, terrifying uncertainty of being cast out with nothing? It wasn't a choice between good and bad, but between terrible and merely frightening. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but amidst the fear, a small, stubborn ember of resolve flickered. This man, this quiet stranger, was offering her a lifeline, not a hand to hold, but a plank to cling to in the storm. She looked at her in-laws, their faces a mask of greed and impatience. She looked at the cabin, no longer a home, but a symbol of what she had lost and what they were stealing. Then she looked at Silas Blackwood, standing alone on the edge of his land, offering his quiet sanctuary. His offer wasn't born of pity, she sensed, but of a practical assessment of a situation, perhaps even a silent defiance of the in-laws' cruelty. It was a bargain, stark and unadorned by affection, but it was a bargain that offered survival. Taking a deep breath that stung her lungs with the cold air, Eleanor nodded, a small, almost imperceptible movement. Her voice was stronger this time, though still quiet. "I accept." A small, almost imperceptible shift occurred in Silas Blackwood's posture. He didn't smile, didn't react outwardly, but his gaze held hers for a fraction of a second longer. The in-laws erupted in protest, but their bluster seemed to dissipate against the quiet resolve of Silas Blackwood and the unexpected defiance in Eleanor's agreement. "This is madness," Uncle Silas shouted, his voice booming across the yard. "You will regret this, Eleanor. Marrying a man you don't know, a peculiar sort like Blackwood." "My regrets are my own," Eleanor replied, her voice steady now. The choice was made. Fear warred with a strange, fragile sense of purpose. She had chosen survival. Silas Blackwood turned slowly, his gaze sweeping over the in-laws one last time before settling back on Eleanor. "I will make the arrangements. The magistrate is in town. We can ride tomorrow." He didn't wait for a reply, simply turned and walked back towards his own homestead, melting back into the landscape as silently as he had appeared. Eleanor watched him go, a mixture of trepidation and a faint, tentative hope swirling inside her. She had traded one uncertain future for another, but this one, at least, offered a roof and the potential for safety from the storm that was her husband's family. The in-laws continued their protests for a few more minutes, threats and accusations hurled into the wind, before finally retreating to their wagon, defeated for now. As the sound of their departure faded, the silence returned, but it was different now. It was the silence of a life irrevocably changed, a path veering sharply into the unknown, towards the quiet homestead and the man who had offered her refuge in the most unexpected way. The ride to town was silent. Eleanor sat beside Silas Blackwood in his wagon, the jolt of the rough road the only sound besides the creak of the wheels and the steady clip-clop of the horse's hooves. She watched the landscape roll by, vast and empty under a pale, cold sky. She felt detached, as if this journey were happening to someone else. Silas drove with quiet competence, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He didn't offer conversation, didn't ask about her past, didn't speak of his own future. The silence between them wasn't awkward, merely present. It was the silence of two strangers embarking on a shared, necessary path. When they reached the small, dusty town, they went directly to the magistrate's office. It was a simple affair. A few questions, the signing of a ledger, a brief, perfunctory exchange of vows that felt less like a sacred union and more like a business transaction. The magistrate, a portly man with tired eyes, seemed to understand the nature of the arrangement, common enough on the frontier where necessity often trumped sentiment. He pronounced them husband and wife, and it was done. Eleanor was no longer Eleanor Thomas. She was now Eleanor Blackwood. The name felt foreign, heavy with the weight of its practical origins. Outside the office, they stood awkwardly for a moment. The deed was done. They were bound together, not by affection, but by paper and circumstance. "We should get supplies," Silas said, his voice low, breaking the silence. "Food. Things for the house." He produced a small, worn leather pouch and counted out some coins. "We will need to make do. Winter is coming hard." They spent the rest of the afternoon purchasing necessities: flour, sugar, coffee, salt, a bolt of sturdy fabric, lamp oil, a few other sundries. Eleanor walked a few paces behind him, observing him. He moved with quiet efficiency, selecting items with care, his gaze missing nothing. He wasn't wealthy, that much was clear, but he was practical, resourceful. As they loaded the wagon, he didn't ask her opinion on anything, but he seemed to notice her silent observation, perhaps taking it as a form of input. Back on the road, the silence returned, but it felt subtly different. They were married now. This was their shared path, however unconventional. Eleanor looked at the back of his head, the set of his shoulders. He was her husband, a stranger she had married to escape desperation, a man who offered a quiet corner of the world in exchange for her presence and her labor. There was no pretense of romance, no expectation of tenderness. It was a stark frontier reality. Survival, not sentiment, was the currency. As they approached his homestead in the late afternoon, the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long, deep shadows. His cabin was smaller than Thomas's had been, simpler, yet it had a sense of quiet permanence, as if it had grown from the earth itself. A plume of smoke rose from the chimney, a sign of life, of warmth. He had likely banked the fire before they left. He pulled the wagon up beside the cabin and began unloading the supplies. Eleanor wordlessly joined him, carrying sacks and parcels inside. The interior was clean, sparse. A small hearth, a rough table and 2 chairs, a narrow bed in one corner, a few shelves holding basic dishes and provisions. It was smaller, perhaps colder, than her previous home, but it was a home nonetheless. Their home now. As dusk settled, Silas lit the lamp, casting a warm, golden glow that softened the harsh lines of the cabin. He started a fire in the hearth, the crackling flames offering both warmth and a small measure of cheer. He didn't instruct her, didn't tell her what to do. He simply went about the necessary tasks, tending the fire, putting away the supplies. Eleanor, finding her rhythm, began to unpack her own meager belongings, placing them neatly in a small chest at the foot of the bed. They ate a simple supper of bread and cheese by the firelight, the silence between them thick but not strained. Eleanor found she could observe him more freely now. He ate slowly, deliberately, his movements economical. His hands were calloused, strong. His face was weathered, lines etched around his eyes, hinting at years spent under the harsh sun and facing the biting winds. He seemed entirely at ease in his own solitude, yet he had sought a wife. A practical arrangement, he had called it. She wondered about his life before, his reasons for being alone, but she didn't ask. Dialogue felt like an intrusion on the quiet rhythm they had established. After eating, he rose and walked to the small window, looking out into the night. Eleanor remained by the fire, watching him. The wind outside had picked up again, rattling the window, reminding her of the world from which she had been saved. She was safe here for now. Safe from her in-laws, from destitution. She had exchanged one form of loneliness for another, perhaps, but this loneliness was shared, a quiet understanding passing between them without the need for words. Silas turned from the window, his gaze meeting hers briefly in the firelight. There was no judgment in his eyes, no expectation, just a quiet acknowledgement of their shared reality. It was a strange beginning to a marriage, built not on affection or shared dreams, but on necessity and a silent agreement to weather the storm together. She was a stranger in his home, bound to a stranger by law, but the cabin felt warm, the fire comforting, and for the first time in days, the knot of fear in her stomach began to loosen, replaced by a fragile, tentative sense of possibility. She had survived the first crucial step. Now came the longer, quieter journey of building a life alongside this silent man, on this harsh, indifferent land. Life with Silas settled into a quiet, disciplined routine. They rose with the sun, worked the land and the cabin, ate simple meals in near silence, and went to bed early, the vast prairie night stretching out around them. Their days were dictated by the demands of the farm and the weather. Eleanor, accustomed to hard work, found satisfaction in the physical labor. She learned Silas's ways, how he planted, how he cared for the soil, how he predicted the weather by the shift in the wind or the look of the clouds. He worked methodically, tirelessly, never complaining. He didn't give orders, simply did what needed to be done, and she followed suit, finding her place beside him. He cleared a small patch for a garden, and they worked the soil together, preparing it for planting when spring arrived. Inside the cabin, she organized their meager supplies, kept the fire burning, mended their clothes and cooked their meals. There was an unspoken division of labor, each contributing their share to the survival of the small homestead. Dialogue was minimal. Practical matters were discussed in clipped sentences. Need more wood. The eastern fence is down. Looks like rain. There were no stories shared, no discussions of their pasts, no expressions of feeling. It was a partnership of necessity, conducted in silence. Yet, in that silence, a different kind of communication began to develop. She learned to read the subtle shifts in his posture, the flicker in his eyes, the tension in his hands. He, she suspected, was learning to read her as well, her quiet determination, the moments when her grief for Thomas surfaced unexpectedly, her innate resilience. One afternoon, a fierce dust storm blew in without warning. The sky turned an eerie yellow-brown. The wind whipped dust into stinging curtains, and the cabin was plunged into a premature twilight. They hurried inside, barring the door and windows, but the dust still found its way in, fine and insidious, coating everything. They sat by the hearth, the wind howling outside, shaking the small cabin. The silence was different that day, filled with the roar of the storm and the shared tension of being at the mercy of the elements. Silas tended the fire, his face illuminated by the flickering flames. Eleanor watched him, the lines on his face deepened by the firelight. In that moment, huddled together against the fury of the storm, the practical nature of their union faded slightly, replaced by the primal reality of shared survival. They were two people, alone against the vast, indifferent power of the prairie. He caught her watching him and met her gaze. For a fleeting second, the usual reserve in his eyes softened, replaced by a quiet understanding. He didn't speak, didn't smile, but the look was enough. It was an acknowledgement of their shared vulnerability, their shared resilience. It was a tiny, fragile bridge built across the chasm of silence and the circumstances that had brought them together. As the storm began to subside, the wind lessening its roar, leaving behind only a mournful sigh, Eleanor spoke, her voice quiet in the aftermath. "Thank you, Silas." He looked at her, a slight frown creasing his brow, as if surprised by the simple expression of gratitude. "For what?" For this," she said, gesturing around the small, dusty cabin. "For giving me shelter. For the chance to live." He considered her words for a long moment. Then, quietly, he replied, "We survive. Not I survive, or you survive, but we." It was a small word, but it held immense weight. In that moment, their practical arrangement shifted, subtle but significant. They were no longer just two individuals occupying the same space out of necessity. They were we, bound together by the storms outside and the quiet understanding within. The dust storm had tested the cabin, tested the land, and in its own way, it had tested them, revealing the tentative foundation of their shared existence. As the last of the dust settled, coating everything in a fine, brown layer, Eleanor felt a sense of belonging, fragile but real, take root in her heart. This quiet, unassuming man had offered her not just shelter, but a partnership, a chance to face the future not alone, but together. Weeks turned into months. Spring arrived, tentatively at first, then with a rush of green across the prairie. The work intensified. Planting the crops required long hours from sunup to sundown. Eleanor worked alongside Silas in the fields, her hands in the earth, feeling a connection to the land that she hadn't felt even with Thomas. Perhaps because this was work done purely for survival, for the promise of food on the table, not for a distant hope of prosperity. The silence between them remained, but it was no longer empty. It was filled with the rhythm of their shared labor, the calls of the birds, the rustle of the wind through the grass. They moved together, a quiet, efficient team. She learned his unspoken cues, the way he held the plow, the timing of his movements, the brief nods that communicated instruction or agreement. He, in turn, seemed to anticipate her needs, leaving a dipper of water by the row where she was working, adjusting the pace to match hers when needed. One evening, as they sat by the fire after a long day, bone-tired, Silas spoke, breaking the usual silence. "My wife died 5 years ago." Eleanor froze, surprised by the sudden revelation. He had never spoken of his past, his reasons for being alone. She had never asked. "She was not strong enough for the winter," he continued, his gaze fixed on the flames. His voice was flat, devoid of overt emotion, but there was a deep sadness beneath the surface, a quiet weight he carried. A fever took her fast. He fell silent again, but the quiet was different now, weighted with the ghost of his past. Eleanor waited, sensing he would say no more unless she prompted him. "I am sorry, Silas," she said softly. Felt inadequate, but it was sincere. He nodded, acknowledging her words. "It is the way of things out here sometimes. The land gives, and the land takes." He didn't elaborate, didn't share details of his life with her, of their life together. But the brief admission was a gift, a small window into the solitude she had interrupted. It explained his quiet stoicism, perhaps, the way he seemed so self-contained. He had known loss too, the profound emptiness left behind. The following morning, as they worked in the fields, the silence between them held the echo of his words from the night before. She felt a new layer of understanding for him, a deeper empathy. They were two people who had lost their partners, finding a strange, quiet solace in each other's company, bound by necessity and shared grief, though it remained mostly unspoken. Their tentative peace was shattered with the arrival of Jedediah and Obadiah. It was a hot summer afternoon, the air thick with the scent of sun-baked earth. They rode up to the edge of Silas's property, not daring to cross the line without clear provocation. They sat on their horses, watching them work, their presence a dark stain on the peaceful rhythm of the day. Silas straightened up, his hand going instinctively to the handle of the shovel he was using. Eleanor felt a prickle of unease. Jedediah called out, his voice loud and mocking, "Well, well, looky here. The widow Blackwood. Found yourself a soft patch. Haven't you, girl?" Eleanor ignored him, keeping her head down, but her hands trembled slightly as she continued to pull weeds. Obadiah chuckled. "Thought you'd be begging on the road by now. Guess Blackwood's tastes are as peculiar as he is." Silas walked slowly towards the fence line, his movements deliberate, his gaze steady. He didn't speak, simply stood there, a silent barrier between them and his land, his wife. "We heard you married her, Blackwood," Jedediah said, a challenging glint in his eye. "A mistake, I reckon. She brought Thomas bad luck, and she'll bring you the same. Best cast her off before she wastes all your stores." "She is my wife," Silas said, his voice low, carrying across the short distance. There was no threat in his tone, but an unyielding finality. "Marriage ain't nothing but paper out here," Obadiah sneered. "We still say the cabin and Thomas's land belongs to us. You sheltering her doesn't change the truth of blood." "The law recognizes the marriage," Silas replied, his voice unwavering. "And the law recognizes a man's right to his land. This land is mine. That cabin was Thomas's. Now she is mine. Your claim ended when we wed." Jedediah dismounted, taking a step towards the fence. "Maybe we need to discuss this more forcibly." Eleanor's heart leaped into her throat. She stopped working, watching, ready to run, or to stand. She didn't know. Silas didn't move. He didn't raise his voice. But his stillness, the quiet resolve radiating from him, was more potent than any shout. "I buried my wife once. I have no intention of burying another, or defending her grave from trespassers." His gaze was level, direct. "Leave my land. Leave my wife be." There was something in his tone, in his eyes, that gave the cousins pause. It wasn't bravado, but a simple statement of fact, a boundary drawn with quiet authority. They hesitated, clearly frustrated, looking from Silas to Eleanor and back again. They were used to bullying, to taking what they wanted from those weaker than them. But Silas Blackwood wasn't weak. He was quiet, solitary, but he possessed an inner strength, a deep-rooted connection to the land and, now, a fierce, quiet protectiveness towards the woman he had married. After a tense moment, Jedediah remounted his horse. "This ain't over, Blackwood. We'll be back." The threat hung in the air, but it lacked conviction. Silas said nothing, simply watched them turn their horses and ride away, disappearing back down the dusty road. Only when they were out of sight did the tension in his shoulders ease slightly. Eleanor walked slowly towards him, her legs feeling weak. She stopped a few feet away, looking at him. His face was impassive, but she saw the flicker of something, determination, perhaps, in his eyes. "They won't give up," she said quietly. Silas nodded. "Not while they think there's something to take." He turned from the fence, looking back at the fields, at the small cabin nestled against the rise. "This is ours now. We defend it." Again, the word "we" it settled over her, warm and reassuring. They were together in this, facing the threat as a unit. The marriage of necessity had become something more, a partnership forged in shared hardship and a quiet, unspoken commitment to protect what they were building together. The fear was still there, a low hum beneath her skin, but it was tempered by the strength she drew from his quiet presence, his unwavering resolve. She had faced her in-laws and their cruelty, first alone, now with Silas. And in standing with him, she found a strength within herself she hadn't known she possessed. The threat of the in-laws hung over them, a distant cloud on the horizon, but life on the homestead continued. They harvested the crops, the fruits of their shared labor filling the small root cellar. The work was hard, relentless, but there was a satisfaction in it, a tangible reward for their efforts. Eleanor felt herself growing stronger, her body leaner, her hands calloused. Her grief for Thomas had softened, becoming a quiet ache rather than a crippling pain. She would always remember him, but she was building a new life now, a life intertwined with this silent, steady man. Their routine remained largely unchanged: the quiet mornings, the long hours of work, the simple meals, the evenings spent by the fire in comfortable silence. But the silence between them had deepened, evolving into a form of intimacy. They didn't need words to communicate. A shared glance could convey understanding. A slight gesture could offer comfort or support. One evening, as the first snowflakes of winter began to fall outside, they sat by the fire, the only light in the cabin. The wind was rising, promising a long, cold night. Silas was mending a harness, his brow furrowed in concentration. Eleanor was patching a worn blanket. The quiet was companionable, warm. Silas finished his task and set the harness aside. He didn't immediately turn to her, but remained gazing into the fire. "You miss him," he said, his voice quiet, not a question, but a statement of fact. Eleanor paused her mending. "Yes," she replied softly. "Always. He was kind." Silas nodded slowly. "He was a good man." Another silence fell, different from the usual. This one was filled with shared acknowledgement of the man who had connected them, whose absence had created the circumstances of their union. "Was she kind?" Eleanor ventured, hesitant to intrude further on his private grief, but feeling compelled to ask. Silas was quiet for a long moment. "She was gentle," he finally said, his voice rougher than before. "Not suited for this life, perhaps. But she tried." He didn't elaborate, but Eleanor sensed the depth of his loss, the quiet pain he carried. They were kindred spirits in their grief, two solitary islands connected by the sea of shared loss. He looked at her then, his gaze steady. "You are strong, Eleanor. Stronger than you know." His words, simple and direct, landed softly in her heart. No one had ever called her strong before. Thomas had protected her, shielded her from the harshness of the world. His family had called her weak, a burden. But Silas, who observed everything and said little, saw something else. "The land, it demands strength," she replied, deflecting the compliment slightly, yet accepting it within herself. "It does," he agreed. "But it takes more than muscle. It takes a will to endure." He looked back at the fire. "You have that." The conversation faded back into silence, but the air had shifted. His acknowledgement of her strength, his quiet sharing of his own loss, had deepened the connection between them. It was no longer just a partnership of necessity. It was a bond built on mutual respect, shared understanding, and a quiet recognition of each other's resilience. The wind howled outside. The cabin was small and remote, but for the first time, it felt truly like home. A sanctuary built not just of wood and stone, but of shared experience and quiet acceptance. The full fury of winter descended upon the prairie. Snowfall after snowfall buried the land, the wind whipping drifts against the cabin, making it feel like a small boat tossed on a vast white sea. They were isolated, cut off from the outside world. Their days became even more focused on survival, tending the fire, melting snow for water, rationing their stores, keeping the livestock alive in the small, sheltered lean-to. The isolation forced them into closer proximity, physically and emotionally. They spent hours together in the small cabin, the silence punctuated only by the sounds of the storm outside, the crackling fire, and the quiet rhythm of their tasks. Eleanor read the worn books she had brought, patched and mended, cooked what little they had with careful economy. Silas carved small wooden figures, sharpened tools, repaired anything that was broken. They existed side by side, two solitary souls creating a shared space in the heart of the storm. The extreme weather brought a new layer of vulnerability. One morning, Silas woke with a hacking cough, his face pale and flushed by turns. Fear, sharp and cold, pierced through Eleanor's practiced calm. Illness out here, cut off from any help, could be a death sentence. She tended to him, fussing over him in a way she hadn't allowed herself before. She brewed him weak tea, placed cool cloths on his forehead, piled extra blankets on him. He accepted her ministrations with a quiet resignation that frightened her more than any protest might have. The stoic, capable man was brought low by a simple sickness, reminding them both of the fragility of life on the frontier. "You shouldn't risk yourself," he rasped one afternoon, his voice hoarse. "If I worsen, you should save the stores for yourself." "Don't be foolish, Silas," she said, her voice sharper than she intended, betraying her fear. "We survive, remember? Together." He looked at her then, his eyes heavy with fever, but holding a flicker of something that looked like gratitude, affection. She couldn't be sure. But the words were a small, significant reaffirmation of their bond. As the days passed, his fever broke, the cough lessened. He was weak, but recovering. The fear slowly subsided, replaced by a deep exhaustion and a profound sense of relief. She had nursed him through it, alone, relying only on her own knowledge and determination. And in doing so, the tentative nature of their marriage had been stripped away, leaving behind a bedrock of shared reliance and care. When he was strong enough to sit up by the fire for longer periods, he watched her with a quiet intensity. The silence between them was different again, charged with the unspoken weight of what they had faced together. "You saved my life, Eleanor," he said one evening, his voice still rough, but clear. "We survive," she repeated softly, using his own words. He nodded, a small, rare smile touching the corners of his mouth. It transformed his face, softening the etched lines, revealing a glimpse of the man beneath the stoicism. "Yes," he agreed. "We do." The storm raged outside, but inside the small cabin, a quiet warmth had taken root, deeper and more resilient than any fire could provide. They had faced down the harshness of the land, the cruelty of outsiders, and now, the fragility of life itself, and emerged, not unscathed, but together. The practical arrangement had bloomed, quietly and unexpectedly, into something resembling true partnership, forged in the crucible of shared vulnerability and mutual care. As winter began its slow retreat, melting snow swelling the creeks and turning the muddy ground to treacherous bogs, the isolation eased, but the bond forged in the cabin's quiet warmth remained. They faced the challenges of the thawing land together, repairing fences damaged by drifts, preparing the fields for planting. One spring morning, as they worked near the edge of the property, a rider approached. It was Jedediah, alone this time, his face grim. Silas straightened, his hand going to the axe handle instinctively, though he didn't lift it. Eleanor stood beside him, her heart pounding, but her stance was firm. She was no longer the frightened widow. Jedediah stopped his horse a short distance away, his gaze sweeping over them, over the well-tended fields, the sturdy cabin. He saw a different picture now, not a vulnerable woman and a peculiar recluse, but a united front, a functioning homestead. "Looks like you survived the winter, Blackwood," Jedediah said, his voice lacking its usual bluster, replaced by a grudging resentment. Silas said nothing, simply waited. "Uncle Silas, he passed away," Jedediah announced, the news delivered with a surprising lack of emotion. Consumption. Eleanor felt a pang of something akin to relief, quickly followed by a wave of complicated emotions. He had been cruel, greedy, but he had been Thomas's family. "We've been going through his papers," Jedediah continued, looking away, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "He had some documents regarding Thomas's land. Seems Thomas. He had a will." Eleanor's breath hitched. A will? Thomas had never mentioned a will. It wasn't common out here. Jedediah cleared his throat, uncomfortable. "It seems Thomas left the land and the cabin to Eleanor, to his wife." The words hung in the air, unbelievable. Her in-laws' claim, their cruelty, their certainty, it had all been based on a lie, a suppressed truth. Thomas had provided for her, had ensured her claim. His family had hidden it, planning to steal what was rightfully hers. Uncle Silas didn't think it was appropriate, Jedediah muttered, a weak attempt at justification. A woman owning land. Silas Blackwood remained silent, his face unreadable, but Eleanor saw a muscle tick in his jaw. Jedediah shifted in his saddle. We thought you were gone, Eleanor. We thought, well, it doesn't matter now. With Uncle Silas gone, and the will found, there's nothing more to discuss. He looked at Silas. The land is hers. The cabin too. He waited for a response, perhaps a challenge, but Silas offered none. Eleanor was silent, reeling from the revelation. The land that had been stolen from her, the home she had been cast out of. It was hers, legally hers. Jedediah seemed to shrink in his saddle under their combined, silent gaze. We won't trouble you further. He turned his horse and rode away, quickly, leaving them standing in the field, the weight of his words settling upon them. Eleanor stood frozen, the truth of her situation washing over her. The fear, the desperation, the marriage to a stranger. It had all stemmed from her in-laws' deception. She owned land. She owned a home. She wasn't destitute. She was a woman of property, thanks to Thomas's foresight. She looked at Silas. He was watching her, his expression still unreadable. Thomas, he provided, she whispered, tears finally gathering in her eyes. But these were tears of a complex sorrow and profound relief. Silas nodded. He did right by you. The wind, softer now with the coming of true spring, rustled the grass around them. The sun felt warm on her face. The land was hers. The cabin was hers. She looked from the fields to the cabin, then back to Silas standing beside her. He was her husband. Not by necessity now, not just for survival. They were bound by law, yes, but also by shared hardship, quiet resilience, and a bond forged in silence and care. What happens now? She asked, her voice small. Silas looked out at the land that was now legally hers. Then his gaze settled on their small cabin, the one they had built a life in, weathered storms in, nursed each other through illness in, the home they had made. He looked back at her, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of emotion in his eyes, a quiet tenderness, a question. The land is yours, Eleanor. Your home is yours, he paused. But this is ours, he gestured around their homestead, their fields, their small cabin. If you wish it. It was not a demand, not an expectation, but an offering. He was not claiming her land, her inheritance. He was offering the continuation of their partnership, their shared life, on the land they had built together, the life they had forged from necessity and quiet strength. Eleanor looked at the land Thomas had left her, the life she thought she had lost. Then she looked at Silas, at the lines of kindness she now saw etched around his eyes, at the quiet strength in his posture, at the hand he held loosely by his side, the hand that had worked tirelessly beside hers, that had reached for hers in moments of shared vulnerability. He was her husband, her protector, her partner. He had offered her refuge when she had nowhere to go, and in doing so, had given her something far more valuable than just shelter. He had given her a future, a present built on shared respect and quiet affection. Yes, Silas, she said, her voice clear and steady. This is ours. A gentle smile touched his lips, a rare sight that warmed her heart. He reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers closing around hers. It was a simple touch, devoid of grand passion, but filled with the weight of their shared journey, their unspoken understanding, their quiet resilience. The future stretched before them, still uncertain, still demanding. The land was harsh, the challenges many, but they would face them together. The widow cast off by her husband's kin had found refuge not just in a stranger's offer, but in the quiet strength of a man who saw her not as a burden, but as a partner. And in doing so, she had found her own strength, her own resilience, planting roots deep in the prairie earth, standing tall beside the quiet farmer who had offered her his hand, building a life together, not of grand dreams, but of enduring hope, quiet dignity, and a profound, unspoken love that had blossomed in the silent spaces between them. The wind still blew, the sun still beat down, the winter would return, but they would face it, together on their land, in their home.